this is Building Levels Fast, an intro to editor blueprints, something that is really powerful within Unreal, but I think a lot of people don't even realize it's there, even though it can be useful to level design, but also a variety of other things of being able to customize the editor using entirely blueprints. So, I'm Victoria. I guess Andrew already did a bit of an introduction, but I work as a technical artist primarily. So I am an Unreal instructor, but so I work with editor blueprints quite a bit and mainly building tools for artists and other roles. All right. I know a lot of our GGDA crowd is primarily Unity developers, so I'm going to do a really brief overview of blueprints just to kick things off before we go into, editor blueprints, so we can get on the same page here. So yeah, we'll start with what are blueprints. So blueprints are Unreal's visual scripting system. This first line at the top here of the presentation, a gameplay scripting system based on the concept of using a node-based interface. That's the definition from Unreal's documentation, though as we're about to talk about, it's used for a lot more than just gameplay. The most common things you'll see it used for when you go and look up Unreal tutorials and whatnot is going to be things like player controllers and characters, any sort of interactive objects in a level, AI, your level functionality. The closest comparison, though not, I guess, entirely accurate to those of you working in a normal Unity workflow, would be prefabs to some extent. Like one thing blueprints are used for is building these classes that have meshes and different components and functionality attached to them that can be instantiated in the level. So in that sense, it is sort of like a prefab, but as we're about to talk about, it kind of covers a lot more, because when we say blueprints, we're not just referring to the type of blueprints that go directly into the level, but anything that utilizes this visual scripting system. And normally in games, blueprints are used with a combination of C++ for your define, I guess, more intricate logic or your base class of something in C++, and then use blueprints for more of, I guess, smaller changes, but also anytime you need to expose being controlling something to designers or non-technical roles, or there's just a visual element to it you don't want to do in code, that's where you kind of switch over to working in blueprints. But you can also build games entirely using blueprints alone, and of course, as we're about to talk about, editor blueprints to modify the editor itself. All right, so I'm going to do a quick example just for those of you who aren't familiar with Unreal at all of what a blueprint is before we talk about what we're doing today. So I have a Unreal project open here. This is just your regular third-person template in Unreal Engine 4. And a blueprint, I'm going to go here to my content browser, create a blueprint class. You pick your parent class. I'm going to pick actor, which is kind of your most basic class to inherit from. That's just, this is something you place in the level. Other than that, it can be really anything. And I'm just going to name it BT. This is a blueprint. That's actually a long name. Maybe I should have named it that. Okay. But instead of like if you're used to working in Unity, so this is something we drag into the level, right? Like a prefab. But instead of like having being able to see it over here and adding on different scripts and whatnot, the blueprint has its own editor where you have viewport. That's where you add components. That's going to be things like your static mesh. I can add a static mesh. I can make it a cube. Make it a 1 meter cube right here. If I had different components which I've added some sort of functionality to, I can add it here. So for example, I'm going to add a rotating movement. So now it has a rotating movement component. And then also each blueprint has its own has its own functionality that can go on the blueprint, in this case the actor itself, rather than just its components. So here, these are, I'm going to take this one out, but some of the common events that get added to actor blueprint by default. The first being, one being event tick, which is essentially, I guess, the Unity equivalent. It's a void update. I haven't worked in Unity for a while, but this is the one that updates every frame, and this is the one that plays once when you first add something to the level or first spawns into the world. So event begin play and event tick. And by node-based scripting, we just mean that we can add nodes to this and drag functionality after it. Each node will execute in the order of this wire. So you can see the execution order right here. In this case, I'm going to copy and add 3 different print strings. One's going to say this first, one's going to say this second, and one's going to say this third. I'm going to compile that, save it, and now if I go into the level, there's this actor we just made, which has a cube on it. It should rotate, and when we start the world, it will print this third, this second, this first, this second, this third. And yeah, you can see we have the rotating component on it, as well as the cube. So that's just kind of a super, super brief overview of some of the stuff you would normally use blueprints for, but that's not actually what we're going to do today at all. But same visual scripting system. All right, so now we're going to talk about what our editor blueprints for. This is, or just editor scripting in general. This is a specific plugin you can enable within Unreal, and that allows you to extend and modify and build tools within the editor. So when we're talking about level design with blueprints, we're usually talking about 3 different goals we're trying to accomplish. It's not necessarily something that goes into game, but something that just helps us build our game, really. So the first thing that you would use editor scripting for is normally some sort of speed related task. You have something you need to do that's kind of repetitive over and over again. I think example here is, say you're building a game made of tiles or cubes, and that's like the map of the world. It's not procedurally generated, and you need a way to quickly edit that in the editor rather than just adding a cube and adding a cube and adding a cube and copying and pasting them. So you might make an editor tool that allows you to make long rows of cubes or make different grids of them in weird shapes and extend that in the editor a bit easily and save yourself time when you're building out a level. The other use of use case of blueprints is going to be editability, just exposing things that you don't normally get read in the editor to people who are in non-technical roles. So say, for example, you're building a dialogue system and you have writers actually working in the engine, and they need to be able to add a bunch of stuff for different lines characters might say and how they react and the different choices. But all that data that's your more technical roles, mostly programmers, are going to be accessing isn't exactly all that editable from the regular editor. So in that case, you could use some form of editor scripting to build a tool for writers to interact with that and add the dialogue they want without the help of a programmer. And then the third case for editor scripting is usually going to be some form of consistency. This is when you have a lot of people trying to do the same thing has room for human error, and if it messes up, it can cost a lot, so you want to ensure that that thing doesn't happen. So this may be something like, oh, ensuring assets are named correctly, or ensuring all the right things are in a level before it can actually be packaged in a game, or ensuring when an asset is imported that it doesn't have an absolutely absurd polygon count or something. All right, so first we're going to talk about speeding up tasks a little more in detail. Again, this is tasks that are repetitive and consistent. Those can be automated. So some examples of this would be project cleanup and organization. Like I mentioned, building similar assets over and over again, placing similar objects in a level over and over again, and adding and managing data for characters, dialogue, combat, quest, whatever. My example here would be, like I mentioned, if we're building a game made of tiles and blocks. Say, for example, if we were recreating Battle Block Theater in Unreal, then we don't want to place every single cube for every single level because there's a lot of cubes in Battle Block Theater that it is called Battle Block. But in that case, we might build a editor tool to let us, say, if we had these little clouds, drag them out, place multiple at a time, quickly build out this level without doing, here's a cube block, here's a cube block, here's a cube block, and so on. So that sort of thing is where we're going to, where editor scripting is really going to help us out with level design. Second, editability. These are tasks that aren't exposed to the editor, can be exposed to non-technical roles to editor scripting, like I mentioned. So this can be adding new things or managing existing systems like new dialogue, new items, enemies, events, I don't know, item cost, enemy stats, or just supporting certain features that aren't really exposed well by default in the editor. So similar to the dialogue example I was talking about before, say you have writers working within Unreal, and there's tons and tons of lines of dialogue within this game. So they need somewhere that they can manage the dialogue, the text that goes with it, the order things show up, the timing, like text pauses at a certain point and then continues, the audio associated with it, characters, animations, their reactions, and then of course branching choices, which if say this dialogue, I know for some reason you have it going into a data table or something, that's going to be really hard to start managing. Or even if they're individual assets, then you're still moving through the content browser a lot. So instead, in this case, we would build some sort of interface where we can allow writers to edit that in a more intuitive manner. Same thing with, say we were building Balloon Tower Defense. Apologies, I clicked that. Balloon Tower Defense has, waves of enemies spawning. There's a lot of levels, but they're all kind of fairly similar, where you have different, I guess, waves, wave timings, enemies that go in the wave, the number of enemies that go in each group per wave, and then different stats like, I don't know, Balloon Tower Defense, the speed they're traveling through the level, right? And then in this case, if we were rebuilding Balloon Tower Defense in Unreal, we might want to use editor scripting to give a designer a way to actually, manage that without having to scroll through, again, data and data and data and data, where they can just have their own little editor within the editor for that. And then, of course, consistency. These are tasks that will cause damage or time lost if they are done in an inconsistent manner. So this can be things like validating game data. So say, for example, we're building a Pokemon-like game. You don't want designers adding battles to the game, because Pokemon has a lot of battles in it, where they set the trainer and the path they walk and the Pokemon they have, but they forget to actually give the trainer any Pokemon. Or they forget to give the trainer lines or something, or they leave it at default. You want to make sure that everything that needs to be there for there to be a battle is actually there, even though you have tons and tons of different battles to manage. So in this case, we might use some form of editor scripting to verify that when a designer adds a new battle to the game, they're actually adding all the data that needs to go with it. And then it also comes to less level design, but more art side of things, with importing, setting up, making sure assets are managed correctly, managing source files, like if you have your FBXs and ZBrush files and whatnot associated with the model, and you don't want to lose that, especially when you, I don't know, are switching. There's a lot of outsourced companies or a lot of companies working together, and you're sending files back and forth, organizing projects, and also optimization policing for some types of games. Put two example situations here. Like I mentioned, say a game has hundreds of people and several studios working on it, and every file must have consistent naming, placement, and completely tracked source files. If people start doing that manually, you start running into some issues where every file is probably not going to meet those conditions. Or a different example, maybe a game has many possible item drops, and like the Pokemon battles, every item must have certain values associated with it, so they don't have I guess most things you would set a default value for, but an item that you forget to add a mesh for, or an item that you forget to give a monetary value for when someone goes to sell at the store, or you forget it's a consumable item and you forget to put stats on it, or someone just kind of leaves that halfway done. You want to make sure those don't end up in the game. So that's where you can use editor scripting for checking on consistency of things. But of course, making all this sort of stuff comes down to really just a cost-benefit analysis. There's a lot of times where you can make a really robust and great tool, but it's only worth the time if it's justified by the benefit. And as I know, there's a lot of indie devs who are part of GGDA and probably viewing this, and a lot of times you're going like, oh yeah, that's really cool to have a system to validate all the assets that you're importing and track their source files, but it's just me and my friend over here. We don't really need that. So yeah, there are some things where editor scripting definitely scales with the number of users, and you're going to get more benefit out of it at a larger company. But because blueprints are so fast and we don't really have to go into the detail of tool development that you normally would if you were just purely to do it in code, you can actually justify some forms of editor scripting, even at the indie scale, technically even at the game jam scale. Like I've made little widgets in 30 minutes to help me with game jams, just to work a little bit faster. And there's I guess a lot of more low-hanging fruit that you can get to. But so let's go ahead and look at the cost. Like, okay, if we're going to decide, I want to automate this thing, or I want to make myself a level builder for these types of levels we're building in the game, and we have 100 of them. How do we actually know if the benefit of that outweighs the time we're putting into it? So the first is obviously counting all areas of the cost of creating a tool. So a lot of people think like, oh yeah, developing the tool, that's how much time it takes me to develop it. But then, no, there's actually a lot more. That's actually a very small portion of it. So you have development, of course, how much time the tool is going to take you to make, but then you have testing, because a lot of times you may make it one way and you send a prototype, and then someone in QA says, hey, no, this is stupid, or you hand it to a level designer, and or yourself or your friend who's the level designer, if you're at a smaller scale studio, and they go, wait, this isn't actually what I need modifications to it. So then there's testing, and then of course iteration to go and make those changes. The bigger your team, the bigger the concern of documentation and training, because you have to make sure that one, people actually know how to use the thing you make, and two, if they get stuck, they have a place to go and figure that out without constantly contacting the developer, because then you spend all this time developing a tool that was meant to you spend all this time supporting a tool just by helping people out when it was meant to save time in the first place. And then there's, of course, the big one, the cost of supporting a tool, which comes with any form of automation. Those are considerations like what would be needed if the needs of this tool changed. We're building out a tile-based level and suddenly want to add diagonal tiles as well. All right, we probably built a tile placing tool to not account for diagonals. Now we need to go back and make that work. How long can we be sure we'll need this for? If something about how the game's made is changed, or if the design changes, then, or how you're doing it technically changes, then you might make a tool that quickly becomes obsolete. Of course, what happens when the engine is updated, because if you're updating your game with the engine, you've got to update all the tools you've made. And then the important one, can this be used for multiple games or projects? It's really nice when you can build some form of a widget or a blueprint that can be used across multiple games, then you're better justifying the cost of that. And then, of course, the big one, what happens when the original developer is no longer working there? If you do get in a scenario where a tool maybe isn't well documented, there's not resources for training people in it, and you have one person who made it constantly helping everyone who's using it, when they're gone, yeah, then the tool kind of becomes obsolete and you've lost a lot of time for support as well. All right, and then all of that, of course, we're going to weigh with the benefits of making some sort of tool to help us build levels faster. So the first, if you're making something to increase speed, you're looking at time saved. That's how many hours are we saving and for how many users. It's much easier to justify something where it's, oh, you have 15 people using this one tool and they're going to use it for 3-4 hours every week for the next year, or versus, oh yeah, this one person wants a tool, they're going to use it for maybe 10 hours for 2 weeks, but then after that 2 weeks, they're never going to use it again. And then editability, when we're talking about making tools specifically for that, is whatever you were trying to expose doable without the tool? How much time does it cost if it is? And would the results be the same? Like in the example of, say, we're building some sort of narrative editing system or for dialogue, then that would be the scenario of like, all right, are writers still going to be able to get the same quality in terms of keeping track of branching dialogue choices if they don't have that branching interface to work with it? And then, of course, consistency, risk reduce. What happens if what we're trying to prevent, actually happens? How much time would it take to clean up? How much time would it cost QA or other roles or whoever's going to end up finding with a problem if you do something you shouldn't, like adding a Pokemon battle that doesn't actually have any Pokemon to battle in it? And then what would happen if, worst case scenario, it made it to a different studio or clients or players, worst of all? All right. And like I mentioned before, the benefit of tools and automation of any form will scale with your number of users. And the speed of creating blueprint tools specifically, it was what allows us to be justifiable on a smaller scale. Yep. Okay, so now we're going to go into how this works in Unreal Engine. Before though, want to stop and see if there's any questions about the previous section. Those of you who aren't familiar with Unreal or just haven't really heard of editor scripting before.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of good comments in the chat so far, but I think they're holding their questions.
Okay.
So I think they all really want to see it in use, getting a lot of praise for the
Okay.
engine as well.
All right, we'll go ahead to that then. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over back to the engine here. To even access editor blueprints in Unreal, you actually have to enable this plugin. So to do that, you go to Edit Plugins, and you type in Editor Scripting. Yeah, Editor Scripting Utilities right here. Now, this is still technically considered in beta in 4.2.7. I'm not sure if it's still considered beta in 5, but I'd say it isn't really, even though it's beta, it's still pretty stable. I've been using it for years and haven't really had any trouble with it. You do run into a few things where there's some things you probably need exposed to the editor that aren't by default, and you have to go and change it and do it yourself. But other than that, it's a pretty solid plugin. You enable it, this will require you to restart the editor. The other one that's super useful for creating some types of tools that I think a lot of people don't know is in here is blueprint file utilities. And this specifically helps a lot when you're managing files that are outside of the engine. Specifically, I don't know if you're working with source files or any sort of document that you're tracking with things that are in engine, then this will allow you to control that from blueprints. So those two things, super useful. All right. And there's a few different types of ways we can create editor blueprints, and some of it's not even with like using that editor plugin itself. Apologies, I have like 2 cats fighting beside me. So the first, this is something a lot of people have seen if they've been working in Unreal at all, is making almost blueprints, but the construction script almost behaves like a tool, or you have some sort of call and editor function that you can access from the details panel. So this, my example here is, I think, a fairly common tool that I've seen a lot of people use, which is, go back here, this smart spline generator, pretty popular on the marketplace, but it is a tool that's essentially based off of the construction script. So you can kind of see what it does, because unlike other parts of your blueprints, your construction script, when you change that in a blueprint, will be called both in game, but also in editor as you're just moving an actor around. So you can get stuff like this, where you're generating ivy and vines and hanging bridges and whatnot by making stuff for the construction script. Okay. I'm gonna go back real quick. But these are kind of restrictive because, one, you don't really have any customization over the menu. Things just kind of show up in the details panel. It's dependent on being in a level, so if you need something that's affecting, I don't know, multiple levels or assets or other parts of the editor, then it doesn't work too well. And also, this is why it's actually my least favorite way to develop tools, is this actually goes into game because it's in your construction script, and this will get called in game. But at the same time, it's kind of the most convenient approach to users because it's sitting right there in the level with things they're editing. You just have to, in this case, rotate something and you get ivy generating all over the place. One big caveat with it is because it will update when you're just dragging things across in the editor. If you have a ton of functionality hooked up to it, you can really start to bog down your editor if it's constantly updating tons and tons of times as you just drag it across the screen. So if you are doing anything in your construction script that's kind of tool-like, I would suggest, actually, it's pretty commonplace, but just putting some sort of Boolean to break out of that and not do any of it if, say, a checkbox in the editor is unchecked, because then you can prevent a bunch of crazy updates and functionality. And if you make tons of duplicates of this actor, it slowing down the frame rate of even the editor. But if we're not working with construction scripts, there are some things that are specific to editor scripting, like scripted actions. And these are going to be things that either apply to, you can do scripted actions for actors, so you can do something to multiple actors in a level, or you can do something, apply something to multiple assets in your content browser. Going back to some of our previous examples, this could be, say, for example, you're trying to validate that all of these was trying to think of the previous examples. The setup for Pokemon trainers that you're going to come across in battle, that all of them have their correct data. Maybe the one way to do that would be through a scripted action. You can just select all the assets in the content browser and check that they actually have the right data associated with them. Yeah, so it's commonly used for modifying and creating assets, organizing projects, checking assets against that criteria. And the good thing about this is it's not dependent on a level. You or at least the ones that are for assets in the content browser, you just run that at any time. And it's convenient to users because it's literally just there in a right-click menu and you run it. You can also, like other things, even make a pop-up menu that requires certain inputs, which gives you a lot more versatility in what you can do there. And then we have, I guess, the third common type of editor blueprint, which is my favorite, editor utility widgets. This is when you want to create an entire menu within the editor. Usually you're going to use this for larger blueprint tools because you don't want someone having to create an entire new tab just for a few little buttons, which ironically is what's in this picture here. But it is kind of your most versatile option because you have complete control of the UI. You can add buttons and scroll boxes and editable text and really whatever you want to create your own little editor. Starting in 5, you can actually add entire viewports within editor utility widgets. So you truly can make an entire second editor. And then, yeah, this is done primarily through, this is done through UMG. And a lot of people, I think, don't like editor utility widgets because they're like, oh man, UMG looks bad by default. They'd rather go and do something in Slate, which if you're not familiar with it, that's just like kind of what's behind UMG. That's Unreal system for creating UI, both in game, and in the editor, and the standalone tools associated with Unreal. They're built in Slate, and UMG is just like your visual interface for that. But a lot of people don't like the look of UMG, and I realized like UMG behind it is Slate. You can get it to look the same as things normally would in editor. You don't have to have really wacky looking buttons and funny colors and whatnot. You can make this look nice. But we'll go into a few examples, all 3 of those in a second. But first, I want to talk about some of the limits of blueprints. So you can usually do more with editor blueprints than you can with gameplay blueprints. So this is primarily because when you're working with blueprints that are meant to be in game, you of course have to worry about things like, frame rate. How long is this blueprint actually taking to run its functionality? But when we're working in editor, our blueprints can get a lot bigger. We're doing a lot more on the blueprint side, just because one, we're trying to meet the criteria to meet that like cost benefit analysis, but also we're not really worried about our tools running at 60 FPS. If this takes, I don't know, God forbid, 40 milliseconds to run and you're working in editor, it doesn't matter. Which means, just blueprints get a lot bigger when you're working with editor blueprints. But at the same time, you can still only get so far without working in C++ at all. So editor blueprints, they're not quite as versatile as regular blueprints yet. There are a lot of times where, like myself working in it most days, it'd say, unless I'm making a really simple tool, there is some portion of it where I will have to work in C++ and at least expose something to a new node to use in blueprints. Or there's a lot of like editor delegates that you just can't bind to from blueprints. Yeah, so not everything's always exposed, and not everything in Slate is available in UMG. Like they're always adding more stuff that can be exposed to it, but there are some scenarios where you're like, oh man, I really just need a suggestion box, and you can't have that in UMG. You have to use it in Slate. And then also Blueprints has very limited options for data structures that you can use. Just like sometimes I think in the past, like one time I needed to build this whole blueprint and then realized, oh wait, I'm really dependent on having an aux tree here. And that's not going to be something you do in blueprints. So I had to rewrite the entire tool in C++ instead. But like, that's just a few considerations. Most of the time, especially when you're making more simple tools, blueprints by itself perfectly fine. And even when you do work in C++, you can make 1 or 2 blueprint functions, which you're exposing to your blueprint, and still kind of work at a quick pace to justify the cost of making this tool. All right, and then some other considerations. If you haven't learned regular blueprints yet and you're looking to jump into editor blueprints, I'd suggest, you know, sticking with the regular blueprints first. One, because you can actually find tutorials on those. Editor blueprints aren't quite as well supported and documented, even though they're really cool. I think that's partially just because the plugin's still in beta. And generally, like, it just feels like you're on your own a little bit more when you're working with editor blueprints rather than regular blueprints. And if you are making them, though, it's best to work within a plugin rather than putting it in your game, mainly because now here it's when you work in a plugin, one, it's easier to apply the widgets or actors you make to multiple games, easily switch those between different games, but also you can kind of keep everything consolidated into a module that's explicitly for the editor only. So you're not as worried about, you know, getting that mixed up with anything actually affecting the game. All right, but now let's jump into the examples in Engine. I'll leave the PowerPoint here and go back to my project. So a lot of these examples were originally meant to be kind of in a workshop format. And when you drag it out, it's going to start creating meshes. If I assign a mesh to it, 1 second. There we go. So here we have a spline. We can drag it out, edit it, drag cubes all through our level. And realistically, this is probably not what you would use it for. Usually these are used for things like roads or placing buildings or building out big areas where you just need to place a lot of meshes really fast in a line. But they're also, this one at least is super, super simple to build. I'm going to open up the blueprint here. And I'm going to jump back to my event graph. So notice nothing's actually in the event graph, because like I mentioned, this is an entirely construction script tool. It's nothing on begin play, nothing on tick, nothing here at all. What the construction script does have is this one function, refresh spline, and then this branch here. This, like I mentioned, is not really applicable in this case, but a lot of times if you are building tools that are based on your construction script, then you want to have this as a guard here so you can turn this updating off whenever you want. If I go in here, I have this live update spline in my details panel, where if I have a ton of these in the level and for some reason I have more intense functionality attached to them and I want to just turn it off, you can always have that there to just stop it. So that's there to block this. But when you go into the actual refresh spline, this is very few nodes. It's a pretty simple blueprint. The only components we have with this is one, a component for instant static meshes and a component for splines. And what this is going to do first is we're going to take whatever mesh, which as you notice is exposed, instance editable, and whatever mesh we've set, and set the static mesh of our instance static mesh component. So whenever this now spawns meshes, or whenever meshes are added to this component, it's going to be whatever mesh we set in the editor here. And now for determining the number of meshes that we have on the spline, that's just going to be based on the length of the spline, right? And whatever we set is our distance between meshes. So you use this, the length of the spline divided by the distance between meshes. For that, you get your number of meshes, and now we can just put it in a for loop and start spawning meshes along that spline. So the instances, or the instant static mesh component, that has a function called add instance world space, which we're going to use to, like I mentioned, add an instance of the mesh we specified in world space. And the world space is just going to come from the spline component, but then we're going to get the distance at a certain point along the spline, a rotation at a certain point along the spline, and spawn the mesh there. And then, of course, use our index of our for loop to determine how far along the spline we're going. So pretty straightforward, not many nodes there. I know I went over it pretty quickly. Anyone not familiar with blueprints is kind of looking at this like, oh my gosh, what's all this? Why are there so many wires with tons of colors? But trust me, if you want to, I'll jump into general chat and Discord after this presentation. And if anyone wants the link to download this project, I have this. So you're like, hey, I want to see how that was made in more detail, then you can have the project. But that's really all that's in this blueprint. And so say if I were using this for like an actual level design scenario, maybe I want to pull out a lot of columns, or using it, I don't know, even if you wanted to place walls or anything along a curve, then this becomes useful. A lot of times what you'll see is leaving this as kind of an editor tool and then having some sort of button you can click or functionality to break these out into individual meshes, and that you can modify them each by itself. And then also an option to like bring them back into the spline, which is a lot of times what I'll do when I'm building spline tools, because when I want to move just one cube, this isn't really all that convenient. But yeah, giant train of cubes we've built here. Those are fun to use. Like I mentioned, though, we have a lot of different types of editor blueprints other than construction scripts. So the next one I'm going to jump into is a actor action example. So this is a different type of blueprint. This one's a actor action, which if I wanted to create one, you don't get it in your regular blueprints. Actually, only the basic actor ones you do. But you can create a blueprint class and choose all classes, and then you have a big choice of things you can use rather than just, your regular parent classes. So if I go and find actor action utility, and I could create a new one right here. But I'm not going to do that because I already made one. Now this is, say the graph's a little bit bigger than the last blueprint, but it's still pretty straightforward. What it does is a request I actually kind of commonly get for artists. Originally, I put these examples together to be less level design focused and more just general editor scripting. So say I have, these three meshes here. One is named bump static mesh, one is named left arm static mesh, one is named linear stair static mesh. Well, a lot of times what happens is people switch out a static mesh and they don't change the name of the actor. So for example, I have linear stair static mesh here. If I switch this out to be another bump static mesh like this, the actor and the world outliner is still going to be named linear stair static mesh. And when artists or level designers or whoever do this a lot, then suddenly you're running into a scenario where you have a lot of actors that are named the wrong thing and you want them to be named what the mesh actually assigned to them is. Or say, for example, I'm just going to rename these other ones too. Right arm static mesh, I'm just going to name actor with wrong name. Right? So what this action is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to select however many actors we want, right-click on it, go to scripted actions, and it gives us this action called match name to mesh. So I click on match name to mesh, and you'll see everything was renamed. Bump static mesh 0, bump static mesh 1, right arm static mesh 0. But let's go into what is in that. So when you build a actor action utility, to get those type of events that you can call on actors, all that's really going to be is just a function like you would in most blueprints. So in this case, I created a function called, like you saw in editor, match name to mesh. And what it's going to do is it's going to just rename our actors. So this little part here, all it's going to do is filter out our static mesh actors. You have a lot of nodes like this that are only available in editor blueprints. Get selected at level actors. Obviously, you can't access that in game. Things like this are going to be things that are enabled when you are working in an editor blueprint specifically. But we'll just put those in a for each loop. And for each of those, cast a static mesh actor to make sure we're not renaming things that aren't static meshes, because some things like blueprint actors placed in the world can be dependent on their name, right? Or we don't want to try to rename something to match a mesh if it doesn't actually have a mesh in it, right? So we're just going to get its static mesh component if it is in fact a static mesh actor. Make sure when the static mesh is actually assigned, you could have a component with no mesh in it. So make sure that's valid. And then what we're going to do over here, I guess I won't go into too much detail here because we're running out of time, but this just is going to increment a name. So when we have 15, we have 15 cubes selected, it doesn't name them cube. It's going to name them cube 0, cube 1, cube 2, cube 3, cube 4, right? So we don't end up with too many repetitive names. This only compares against what you have selected. I guess ideally it would be everything in the level, but it's all right for this example. So this is just going to associate an index with each name. And then once we've done that, we're going to go ahead and set an actor label. So we get the name of the static mesh. We append that with a string to the index we associated with that name, or what index it should be at. And then we rename the actor. Set actor label. I think this is also, okay, no, okay, I was thinking it was an editor node, maybe not. But yeah, I can actually scroll down here, open up editor or editor scripting, and there's a lot of different nodes in here that are specific to editor scripting, like destroy actor, editor end play, load specific levels. You can do that from blueprints, replace selected actors. You can also like make sure people are connected to version control, save things for them, check out things for them from here, which is really useful when you're working in tools that affect that. But yeah, pretty straightforward. Again, I'll have the project files for anyone who wants to look more closely through this. But you can see in just a few nodes, this maybe take like 5-6 minutes to build. And you now have something that can rename as many actors as you need in the level without having to go through these and renaming all of them individually. Okay, my third example I have here, this is the editor utility widget submission. So this is a super simple example of an editor utility widget. Ideally, I think you'd use it for a bit more before building one of these where it needs its own interface. But it is something like we can cover and be built really quickly, and we can build it really quickly. So editor utility widgets, unlike some other things, if you double click on them, it's not going to actually run the widget. It's going to open the editor for it. To actually run the widget, you have to right click on it and click run editor utility widget. And this is going to give me this menu I built over here called BP Auto Screenshots. And what this does, you'll notice I have an absurd number of cameras placed in here. What this is going to do is it's going to get all the cameras in the level, put them in this scroll box with a little widget, and it's going to let me take screenshots from each of these. So I can enable whatever cameras I want to have screenshots coming from them or disable them, rename what I want the screenshot to be, and change where I'm going to have those screenshots saved to. So I don't want to render out all of these. I'm just going to have maybe 3 of them checked off, right? But then I'm going to click render, and now it's going to start jumping through the camera and render these different things I placed. And it's going to tell me good job when I'm done. I don't know, I just thought that should be in there. And if I open the folder it's saved to, you can now see I have 3 different screenshots taken from those 3 cameras in the level. All right, let's jump to what's actually in this blueprint. So this is UMG. If you've used Unreal before, you probably recognize it because it's the exact same thing you would use to build UI and game. Pretty much everything's the same, except that you have access to, editor-specific stuff when you go into the actual blueprint side of it. But UI is pretty straightforward. You get like a few different borders, some text, editable text box here for where we save a screenshot, and then we have a scroll box to fill with the different cameras, our render button, and our cancel button if for some reason we need to cancel the render midway. What it's going to fill the scroll box with, though, is actually a separate widget, editor utility widget camera sub-widget, and this is a super simple one. It has some text and it has a checkbox because that's, all we're going to really need for this. But so with widget blueprints, you have your designer side, of course, where you're going to actually set up what goes into this widget, and then you have the graph side, and this is where you start to see your normal, regular blueprint stuff, right? So this is going to have 2 different parts to it. First, where we actually set up the tool. This is going to be where it finds all the cameras and it adds them to that scroll box. So I'm going to open up this function, and all this is going to do is it's going to get all actors in level that are of the class cinematic camera actor. And for each of these, we're going to create that sub-widget, this sub-widget, right? We're going to set the text, and then we're going to add this add this widget as a child to our main widget that we're in right now. So the scroll box we have as the variable, and add child is the widget that we've just created. It goes over here, right? So pretty straightforward. And then we have where we're going to actually take a screenshot. So when we click the button render, what this is going to do is do a little bit here to make sure we're actually saving these screenshots to some place that actually exists, right? And then we're going to get all the cameras to render. We're running out of time, so I won't go into this, but if you want me to cover it in Discord, I can. And this is just going to get each camera, its name, and the camera associated with it. And the name is just going to be whatever we set the text here, in case we want to, name the screenshot something different. And then this is just the for each loop, except I've taken a delay node and stuck it straight inside the for each loop, so that we're going to have 2 seconds, get a screenshot, 2 seconds, get a screenshot, 2 seconds, get a screenshot, and we're going to go through all of our different cameras, save it over to the save location. Get screenshot, that's just based off of our take high-res screenshot function that's normally available in the editor. It's just going to pilot the camera, take a screenshot, stop piloting the camera. Pretty straightforward. And then once we get through that entire loop, all it's going to do is going to show us a little message dialog. This, again, is something available only in editor because you don't make editor pop-ups in game. But show message dialog, it's nice for notifying people when a tool that takes a while is done. And all it's going to say is screenshots complete. Good job. There we go. So yeah, that is a editor utility widget. All right. And then finally, it's kind of a last example. What I have here is adding a toolbar button, because not only can you make stuff for the editor, make menus for the editor through blueprints, but you can actually extend the toolbar itself, add buttons, add entries to different menus. And this is going to be through a blueprint called a editor utility tool menu entry. So you'll see I have this button up here. I just made it say happy message, picks the icon, and when you click on it, it tells you hello. That's all it really does. But these are kind of useful because remember, like with that editor utility widget we made, the auto screenshots, say we wanted people to use this, but we didn't want them to have to dig through the content browser to find where the editor utility widget is, right click on it, click to run it, so on. So instead what we can do is we can add it so it opens a button. Though in this case, we're just having open a dialog box. But we have 2 different events in here. One for when it runs. This is where it's going to register the actual button and then execute. This is where you click on it and it's going to show a message dialog. I guess you can go and look at the documentation for editor utility tool entry menus, because you can actually do a lot more here. But I guess this is just some of the stuff here. And then here's where I define what's it called, where it shows up in the menu, where the section it shows up in the menu, and so on, or an icon, or other specific things. I honestly don't use this too much other than for just toolbar buttons. Usually I'll do that in C++, but you can do this in blueprints. The only thing that's required here is a entry in your config to make sure this runs at startup. You can add it to the default editor per project user settings. And if I open this, click edit, you'll see I've added the section here that just adds as a startup object. Again, examples, toolbar example, BP toolbar example, and it's going to add this to our editor. If I wanted to make it, open an editor utility widget instead of showing just that little pop-up, you can grab the editor utility subsystem. Yep. And then you can spawn and register a tab. So in this case, say I selected it to be BP auto screenshots, then I can have it, instead of showing this message dialog when I click that button, open that little menu that we made. Though I'm not going to do that now because this will actually require restarting the editor to get it to show up. But you can do that. Okay. So those are kind of all 4 examples I have. I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint and we're going to get to questions in a second. Sorry, I went through that really fast, though I know it's, if you guys need help in blueprints and Discord afterwards, I can help out. This is just kind of just a brief overview of here's the things you can do and a little taste of editor scripting in Unreal. All right, I'm also going to link some learning resources here, things I find useful because it's kind of hard to find resources on editor scripting, but there is a Udemy course on it called Becoming an Unreal Automation Expert that I really like. It's teaches you to do things in blueprints in Python, because you can actually use that for editor scripting in Unreal as well, and then in C++. And then you have a few different things like making tools in UE5 series. That's pretty nice. And there's actually one lesson supported by Epic in their learning portal that's creating a simple scatter tool. So that's kind of neat. And that one's super beginner friendly, so I'd suggest that. But if anyone wants to jump into Discord, like the project itself, if you guys want this PowerPoint, so you don't have to type in this, I can give you guys all these links as well. And then one just last thing, miscellaneous reminders for blueprinters, because like I mentioned, the editor graphs can get a lot more complex than gameplay graphs you're building. You kind of have to take in a few more considerations, specifically anything you would do that in code makes your blueprints in code to make something cleaner, you would want to do the same thing in blueprints. So this means things like actually utilizing local variables, not having huge sprawling event graphs, using reroute nodes and comment boxes when you can, because editor blueprints can get enormous and difficult to work with very quickly, more so than gameplay blueprints. So just, be careful with that. And, if you wouldn't do it in code, don't do it with blueprints. All right, that's everything I have. I think we have 6 minutes left. Okay, yeah, finished on time. Yeah, so questions.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you very much, Victoria. We do have a number of questions. A lot of praise for what folks were seeing along the way. I think this was the most common question we were getting. What are your other favorite plugins for working with blueprints?
I think, let's see, those are the two I kind of use the most commonly. Honestly, there's a lot of plugins in here that I have absolutely no idea what they do, and very few people out there use them because there's just a ton of them. I'm trying to think. Those are the two I kind of use the most often for blueprints.
All right.
There's probably some that apply to editor blueprints, but I haven't actually really used them specifically other than the blueprint file utils and editor scripting utilities. A lot of these are kind of niche areas of the editor.
All right.
So I'm not sure if it's a plugin in 5 still, but in 5 now you can edit meshes in Unreal and make tools to edit meshes, save out meshes, create things entirely procedurally in Engine and build tools around that. I'm not sure if that's a plugin or just built into the engine, but that's one I'm super excited about using.
All right. We had a question in Twitch when you were going through the blueprint class, showing how to create a blueprint class. They're asking what other classes would you create a blueprint class for?
Yeah, so, oh gosh, so you can create a blueprint class for a lot of things. I'm just going to go over the common classes here. But if I don't have this all classes expanded, you'll see kind of your common things here. You have your basic actor. That's, like I mentioned, something that you place in the world. Can be kind of just generally anything. Your pawns and your characters, these are things that you, as a player, or technically like as a AI working on that, though I think this creates a player character. You actually control, that's the character you move around, or a pawn is like essentially kind of like a character. It's the parent class of a character. It doesn't have the functionality for walking and running and human-like things. Player controller, you can make a blueprint for that. That's going to be that's going to be like kind of what actually takes in inputs, and you use that to control your character or pawn, right? Your game mode, that's functionality that's relevant to the entire game, and then every level also has its level blueprint, which is functionality specific to the level as well. Then you have actor components and scene components. This is going to be what's most similar to like script you drag onto a prefab in Unity. That's like, I'll go back to the actor blueprint example. That's these things, like adding the instances components or the spline, or in the first example, the cube is a component, and you can add as kind of any functionality you want to a component and then add it to tons of different actors. Some of the other ones include things like, oh gosh, there's a lot of niche areas of preference as well. Like it's not actors you're placed in the level. Like you have animation blueprints for controlling animations. You have widget blueprints other than editor utility widgets. You have regular widget blueprints for creating UI and game. And I don't know, there's so many of them. There's a ton, but I think those are all the most common ones.
Excellent. Great to see. I had a question specifically about optimization. So you talked already about how editor blueprints will be bigger than the game blueprints you'll put together. If you're not working in C++, what can you do to optimize your blueprints? Of course, the general solution for everyone is work in C++. After you've done your blueprints, use it as your prototype to build C++. But
there's definitely stuff you can do in blueprints still. I think the things I find people most guilty of, especially when they're starting off in blueprints, is one, putting things on tick. Like if you're working in Unity, that's kind of like your update. That's the thing that's going over and over and over again, because of course any functionality you put in there is going to be a lot more expensive than functionality on like begin play or one specific event. Most of the time, you don't really need to put anything on tick at all. People overuse it a little bit. You can actually make your project by default start with all actors having tick disabled, which can help in the long run, and you just enable it when you need it. And then the other thing that people do a lot is not managing how actors or blueprints kind of share references and pass information between one another. And they use this node that I used once in here, actually, the get all actors of class, and they'll use it over and over again, or even worse, use it on tick sometimes, I see. And that's kind of one of your most expensive common blueprint functions that gets overused, where it's going to have to go through everything in your level. Sometimes you have a huge level and find the blueprints of find the actors of a specific class. That can get extreme quickly. So yeah, avoid those things. Other than that, just think anytime you can avoid iterating over something over and over again, or iterating over lots and lots of something, helps a lot with blueprints.
All right, great stuff. We are now at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, Victoria. Victoria will be in our general voice chat in a minute, and we'll bring Puzzles by Joe Cassava over here to speak on secrets of the massively good enough level design. So hold on, and we'll be right back.
Thank you.